Our top story today, the mayor has released his recommended budget, and an analysis by the Comptroller's office found more than $30 million worth of highly questionable revenues. While there's been some progress on boosting structural revenues, those increases serve only to keep pace with rising expenses, doing nothing to close the massive budget gap that led the city to use $35 million in reserves last year, and another $30+ million is expected this year. The new proposed budget only uses $4 million in reserves, but that's because there simply just aren't enough reserves left to balance the budget. So what we've seen is a budget built on pie-in-the-sky revenues, like we've seen in previous years, but this time the stakes are so much higher because the city doesn't have the reserves to bail it out of reckless revenue estimates. Now, Mark, you're very concerned about the dire consequences that can result from these reckless revenue estimates. If they don't come in, we don't have the reserves to pay them off.
Yeah.
So there could be some very tough choices for the city to make, whether it be to get rid of the rainy day fund, which would take charter amendment. They would have to change the charter. That would be frowned upon by the rating agencies, and the rating agencies could lead us to a downgrade, which could cause interest costs to go higher. And it also, if the budget comes in so far under budget, that it could lead to the control board coming back.
Yeah, these are all things that are troubling to me. But before I even begin to comment on some of the things that you said, let's just stay for a moment, with the rating agencies. I've been the Buffalo City Comptroller for the last 7 years. And over that time, we have earned upgrades from the rating agencies. And in November of 2016, Fitch awarded us with AA-. It's the highest rating in Buffalo history. And so my office, we have really cultivated a relationship with the three rating agencies. We've understood really what's on their mind. And over the last 7 years, I've listened to them when they talk about how important it is in terms of having a fund balance. And they also pointed out early on that if you begin to use the fund balance on an ongoing basis, then, Patrick, that becomes a trend, meaning negative. There's positive trends and there's negative trends. This has been a negative trend. I've been the Comptroller for 7 years. Over the last 7 years, the mayor and the administration, they have used $85 million of Buffalo's savings to balance the budget.
And on June 30th, they're going to need another $30+ million to balance that budget, bringing the reserves used to well over $100 million.
It's problematic. And so, therefore, I understand we're in a situation right now at current events. We have a budget, the 2018-19 budget, and the mayor is required to submit it to the Comptroller, which he has on May 1st. And then we are required to respond to it officially in writing within 10 days, and we will. And there are many concerns, some of which that you have outlined already, but I just want to center in on the one thing, in terms of fuzzy math or pie in the sky. You are quite right. In the past, if they made a mistake or two, they would go right to the reserve fund, and then they would balance the budget. Well, there ain't no reserve funds anymore. And quite frankly, the reserve fund that is out there right now, $3.9 million, I would call that creative reserves because it comes from a reserve from a capital outlays line. And so it's problematic to me that I've seen the general fund, I've seen the unassigned category, and I've seen it dwindle down to nearly nothing. And so when you talk about some of these revenues, that the mayor and his administration are counting on. I'm praying for it. I hope that the mayor and his commissioner of finance, I hope they're right. But when they are saying they're expecting $17 million to come in from casino revenues, and everybody knows that casino revenues have been suspended by the Seneca Nation because they're having a dispute with New York State. So I suppose the mayor and the commissioner of finance could say, well, we have until the end of fiscal year 18-19 for that revenue to come in, $17 million. And all I can say, Patrick, is I hope so. But we know that there is a dispute, and we also know there's a lot of political things that go on during a campaign. The governor's running for re-election. So I am very worried about this $17 million. Then, the other area of concern to me is land sales. That they've estimated $8 million for one fiscal year. But we know historically, over the last 5 years, they've brought in less than $4 million altogether. So that's concerning to me.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the city-owned real estate that is supposed to bring in $8 million, and as you mentioned, has failed to bring even half of that the past 5 years combined.
It's troubling.
But I do want to touch more on this casino revenue and just the $17 million that is included in the budget. That represents not only the annual payment to the city, but also $10 million in back payments. So the city hasn't really realized any revenue this current year. That will be about $7 million. It got only about half the revenue it was supposed to get, $3.5 million the year before. So, the city considers $10 million owed to it, and then another $7 for the upcoming year. But there's been no progress on these talks between the Seneca Nation and New York State that would lead anyone to believe that there's assurances in place that the city would not only A, get the current year's revenue next year when it takes place, or B, get all these back payments. And there's nothing to say that the city is going to have the same rate of roughly $7 million a year.
So let's just start with the past payment that they owe us, $10 million. It's actually $10.4 million. And so I'm very concerned about that, Patrick. Why? Because I happen to know that the mayor did present this to the governor and to the budget department of the New York State budget, and looking for that $10 million. Now, and the listeners know that the budget process has come to a close in New York State. April 1st, they passed an on-time budget. There was no $10 million in there that was requested by the city of Buffalo, by our mayor, to New York State legislature and to the governor. So that's the first strike that concerns me. Then they've forecasted approximately $7 million that will come in the 18-19 budget. And you're right, there has been no progress. Right now, there are arbitrators who aren't even in place yet to argue. I believe I think there has to be 3 arbitration panelists. I think maybe there's 2. The 3rd hasn't been appointed yet. And so time is ticking. And so that is a major, major concern.
Now back to sale of city-owned land. The city, as we mentioned, only got $4 million the past 5 years combined. Over that time period, they've budgeted more than $30 million for that, and the revenue is just not coming in. They said at the end of last fiscal year, it's just delayed. But here we are this fiscal year. We're 10 months in, 2 months to the next fiscal year, and the amount of money we received is highly negligible. In fact, only $250,000 came in this year, even though it was budgeted for $7 million. So it's just another one of these fuzzy revenues you mentioned, where they have this gap to fill, and they just put some bogus numbers in there to get through and say that the budget is balanced.
And as you mentioned in your opening remarks, in past years, when you have a reserve, and if something doesn't come in, you have an option to do something about it. They don't have that option anymore. So when they are budgeting $8 million for land sales, and we know historically what they've done, and to be fair, sometimes it's complicated. Sometimes there are very complicated deals that do take some time to develop. I get that, but be careful when the reserves are dwindled down to nothing and this budget becomes more important than ever. This is the most important budget in a decade in the city of Buffalo. Why? It's because they don't have reserves to cover it or to balance the budget. And the control board, which has been advisory since 2012, could go back into a control period, especially if the numbers projected in this budget do not come through over the next 12 months when the fiscal year begins in July 1st.
I believe they have a deficit over 1% of the city's budget, that the control board can use that to activate into hard control board. And the last thing that people want is a board of appointees making decisions that they elected leaders to make, the mayor, the council, and the controller's office. So it's very troubling when that could be another result of this budget.
You raise a good point, and the listeners, I think the viewers understand, we've had this conversation before, but the enabling legislation back in 2003, and then it was amended in 2004, created the Buffalo Fiscal Authority, the Stability Authority, the control board in essence. And so there are certain things that four things in particular, Patrick, if they go wrong, if there's not a balanced budget. And so this is the reason why this is so concerning to me. Okay, so Buffalo's going to be okay as we go forward in 2018-19. But as that year concludes, if it's not real, if it's fuzzy math, if it's pie in the sky, then a balanced budget for the next fiscal year could be under question, which then the control board could come in. If we're unable to pay the principal or interest on our bonds, or if, as you mentioned, if there is an operating deficit, that's problematic. Or if I can't certify, to sell securities, that is another problem that would prompt the control board to go into a control period, which means the policy makers in City Hall, including the mayor and the 9 council members, they would be rendered as nothing to do because the control board would do everything.
Now, I want to get a little bit more into some of the revenues that are overestimated, the ones that we didn't touch on yet. And I also want to talk about some of the underestimating of some expenses and our cash flow issues and the reserve position the city's in. But we have to take a brief break.
Okay.
So stay tuned for more Comptroller's Corner after this message. Welcome back to Comptroller's Corner. We've been talking about the city's recommended budget for the upcoming fiscal year and some of the highly questionable revenues. We touched on $17 million in casino funds that we haven't seen come in well over a year, $8 million in land sales when only $4 million came in the past 5 years combined. And another area where we've seen revenue increase is the Traffic Violations Agency. Last year, that agency brought in $4 million. This year, it's projected to bring in about $3 million, with revenues going down from that agency. But despite these numbers, the Traffic Violations Agency revenue in this current budget that has been just proposed is $6 million. Yeah. Now, Mark, you haven't seen the evidence to show that despite declining revenues, that it's going to be twice as much as we're expecting it to be this current year, next year.
Yeah. And again, I suppose because this was a change, where it actually went from New York State to the city of Buffalo, and I suppose it took some time, to figure out how to do it. And I suppose that when they budgeted the number they budgeted last fiscal year, certainly it would come in a little bit less. But again, this year is concerning to me because, as you point out, they're expecting $6 million. And in the past year, which ends in about a month or so, they're only going to bring in about half of that. So that is concerning to me. It all adds up, Patrick. It all adds up, and so it's a concern. And these are only in the beginning of the program you mentioned that the Comptroller's office is certainly concerned about $30 million or so, but we're just centering in on maybe 4 different things right now. We'll talk about the entertainment tax in a minute, but as far as I'm concerned, this is really a problem. And then you also had mentioned there are certain things that are under budgeted, that are concerning to me, because the overtime over the last several years, especially in terms of police and fire, have been substantial. And so I've said right from the beginning, the mayor needs to have a very disciplined 2018-19 budget. And it doesn't look very disciplined to me. It looks like more of the same, with one major thing missing, and that is reserves to cover the mistakes.
Now, you mentioned the entertainment tax. Now, this is similar to what the traffic violations was a few budgets ago. Now, they had this idea to do the traffic violations, and they got the authority from the state. But it took a while to realize that revenue. So they put it in the budget, but then they needed the legislation to pass in Albany to do it. They needed to build an actual office space downstairs in the first floor of City Hall to receive this revenue from citizens. And then they needed to hire the judges and all the people to work in the office. And at the end of the day, it took many months to get this going, and the revenue wasn't there. So the entertainment tax and this gift and charitable fund, are we going to see the same situation there, where we just don't have the details? Oftentimes what we've seen is they're put in the budget and the details are to be figured out later, but things aren't figured out very quickly in government, and a lot of time it takes more time than more time than you're expecting. And this is $2 million in revenue for an entertainment tax. This is charging people that are going to a ball game or a hockey game or a Shays show. And then this gifts and donations, this is charitable giving to the city. And we just don't have the details and the ducks in a row to show us that this is real money that's going to bring in $2 million apiece.
Well, talk about the ducks in a row. There's an old adage also that suggests don't count your chickens before they're hatched. And again, this is exactly what the administration is doing. And in past years, it's okay, I suppose, if you have reserves to cover the mistakes that you've made in the budget process. And so now, as everybody knows in the city of Buffalo, the reserves have dwindled down to nearly nothing. So when the mayor has proposed this tax, this entertainment tax, on Kleinhans, on Canal Side, on Shays Buffalo, on the Key Arena where the Sabres play, and they have Coca-Cola Field, it is somewhat problematic because it takes coordination. You have to communicate with the stakeholders here. And so just to put in $2 million, because that's going to make everything add up real nice, where they have no idea really what it's going to mean, in terms of revenue. Now listen, I understand the logic behind it, and I actually think the mayor has made a good point that if the citizens of Buffalo have a responsibility, and police have a responsibility for safety for all citizens who come to Buffalo to enjoy sports or the theater, I get it. Okay, that's a debate that the policymakers can have, and I suspect they will. Several council members are not happy about this. They're not happy about this entertainment tax because there are families who live in the city of Buffalo who try to go to different events and they're unable to afford it. No, everybody doesn't have an expense account like businessmen and women who work in Western New York, and they have a business account where they can go to games and entertainment to bring clients. There are families who try to participate in the different events, and now they're going to be taxed. There are council members who I know are going to make some noise this week and over the next 22 days before when they have to deliberate on this budget.
And a $1 or $2 fee on a Sabres ticket, a $60 Sabres ticket, has less of an impact than a $1 or $2 fee on a $5 Buffalo Bison's game. So there should be some scale going on there as far as the price of the ticket goes. But again, what we've seen is we don't know any of the details because they're not worked out yet. And it's really putting the cart before the horse in this aspect. And to be counting on that for $2 million in revenue is a little premature. So we spent a lot of time on revenues, Mark. I want to talk about expenditures.
Sure.
Now, the city has had an issue with overtime, roughly $30 million over the past 3 years or so. Nothing under $26 million in overtime expenses for the city of Buffalo, mostly police and fire. Despite this track record and revenue, expenses on overtime being around the $30 million ballpark, the budgeted amount for overtime in this proposed budget is only $16 million. That's barely more than half of the revenue or the expenditures for overtime that we've seen in recent years. And with retirements going in, they're struggling to keep hiring to keep pace with retirements. So you don't see a reduction of 45% in overtime this coming year, and you think this is another area where they're using fuzzy math and they have a hole and they're trying to use it, so they underestimate overtime expenses drastically.
And so I've mentioned several times that discipline is something that you really need to have when things get a little tight. And in the past, Patrick, I've made it perfectly clear that there is going to be overtime. I expect it for firefighters and police officers. These are public safety officers, and there are times where if they're not feeling well, or if they have an injury, they cannot go to work because they need to protect themselves, their family, and the citizens of Buffalo. And so there is going to be overtime. I'm good with it. But what I'm not good with is the overtime that has gone the last 5 or 6 years to maintenance, janitorial staff, and to clerical. These are not sworn officers. And so this is troubling to me. And if there's ever going to be discipline, it needs to be instituted now.
Yeah, and you have focused on overtime in many of your audits. In fact, you mentioned the one audit of the fire department that showed the civilian side of it. We're making vast amounts of overtime. And in fact, some civilian dispatchers were working 48-hour shifts where the city was actually paying them 10 hours in those 48-hour shifts to sleep. So the city's really got to get a handle on this overtime, or else we're going to find ourselves in the situation like I mentioned, where revenues and expenditures aren't linked up, and now, as you mentioned, we don't have the reserves to get us out of that.
There is mismanagement that is going on within the police department management team, and there is mismanagement going on within the fire department management team. I am not talking about the firefighters who are out in our community saving and helping save lives. I'm not talking about the police officers who are on the streets each and every night trying to make our city safe. I am talking about the management teams of fire and police under the mayor who need to do a better job. And in several of our audits, we have suggested that they should put in a finance manager because somebody needs to count the money and the overtime that they're using on an ongoing basis, rather than what they're doing is being surprised at the end of 6 months or 8 months or 12 months. Oh, we spent that much? No, I know that they're spending that much because these are historical numbers.
Now, reserves, we've been talking a lot about how they're not going to be there to balance the budget, even though they've been used for the past few years to get the city out of some budget gaps. But there's also other ramifications of having a lack of reserves. One of them is lawsuits. If the city doesn't have enough reserves on hand and they settle a lawsuit or lose a lawsuit, upwards of millions of dollars, that could put a huge financial strain if we don't have the money in the bank there. But also the more pertinent and real actual issue that we know we're going to be facing this next upcoming year is cash flow issues. Because if we don't have the reserves for the cash flow purposes, the city's going to have to go borrow money, and they're going to have to borrow money just to pay its bills. Now, there's going to definitely be some borrowing in that aspect this coming year, and it could cost the city $1 million in interest. Now that's troubling when if we had the reserves there, we could save not only the $1 million in interest, but we wouldn't have this problem paying our bills, and we wouldn't have to worry about the next lawsuit coming through.
So the citizens of Buffalo, they know that I've had the privilege of serving as comptroller for the last 7 years. This is the first year I've ever had to really worry about cash flow. From last December until the end of June, which ends our fiscal year, we in the city of Buffalo have a cash flow problem. And it's very, very concerning to me. So much so that I went to see the mayor 22 weeks ago to tell him, Mayor, we have a cash flow problem, and there's only two solutions here. One is that you and I, and my department and your administration, we really need to work closely together, and I'm willing to do it, Mayor. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to work with you. I will share with you the information on a weekly basis on our cash flow. That's what I've done. The other alternative, if the mayor decided that he didn't want to work with me, he said he did. He wants to work with me, and we've been working together for 22 weeks trying to figure this out. The other alternative I had was to do what is called a RAN, a revenue anticipation note. I can go and borrow money and to help pay our bills on a monthly basis, which the rating agencies would be wild about that in a negative way because we didn't plan for it. I didn't do that. I could have done it, and I could do it without the mayor, and I could do this without the council, but I didn't want to do it. I'd rather work together with the mayor and the council members so that we get through this tough period of time, and we can do it.
Well, the council just has a couple weeks to make any changes to the mayor's budget. But that's all the time we have, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Pat.
And thanks for joining us at home. Make sure to check out the Comptroller's website, our Facebook page, our YouTube handle, and our Twitter page. On behalf of Mark Schroeder, this is Pat Curry signing off.